All right, thanks guys. Just to start off with, again, if anyone has a Halloween costume, let us know. It is our Halloween dress up day, so I I am an opossum. I almost was a cicada just for this presentation, but I decided that this costume was going to be a little bit more wearable long term. So there's that. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I am currently in Illinois. I am at DuPage Wildlife Conservation Center, which used to be Willowbrook Wildlife Center. In the rehab sector, people probably know that name more. We are a pretty high volume, all species or most species rehabilitation center. We take in about 11,000-ish animals a year, like many centers, going up every single year. So I think we're at 10,850. So we'll be somewhere above 11,000, which is great. For us, for the animals, not so much. So again, today I'm going to be talking about a very fascinating phenomenon that we experienced in 2024. And some of you may have experienced this in 2021 as well. We'll talk kind of about some history going back to this process. But we are going to talk about the suspected hypovitaminosis A in avian species during a cicada emergence. Slides moving okay? Perfect. All right, so we have to start out with some historical information before we talk about what we experienced. As some or many of you guys remember, there was this mystery songbird disease spreading across the some of the Midwest states, but mostly Northeast and Atlantic states between April to July in 2021. Various juvenile passerine species were affected: robins, blue jays, grackles, and then some raptor species, mainly Cooper's hawk and sharp-shinned hawks. All of these individuals were affected with ocular and neurologic signs. Ocular signs being ocular discharge, crusting, swelling, you name it. Neurologic signs: ataxia, wobbliness, mentation changes. A lot of birds were just found deceased. These two birds are from this really, really nice summary paper that they put out, after this disease process went through, and they did some testing on it. And I did link it to a QR code. So if you guys are able to screen that, you'll go to the document, which was great. I stole these pictures from that document. In 2021, interestingly enough, we did get one singular blue jay with suspect clinical signs. At this point, very early on in the game, no one knew much about this disease or what was happening or connecting it to cicadas or anything like that. Everyone freaked out. It was a fun time. I don't believe we treated this individual. I do believe we euthanized based on potential infectious disease, but just interestingly, we got a singular case. The Midwest didn't seem to be as heavily affected as places like Washington, D.C., even Pennsylvania, places like that. I'm going to move this little screen because I cannot see my words. There we go. So during this time frame, most of the states that were affected were experiencing the brood X or brood 10 cyclical cicada emergence. However, at that point, so little was known about this disease that they really did approach this like an emerging infectious disease. Obviously, in retrospect, we now have experienced avian influenza, H5N1, so approached it very similar in regards to that. So many rehab centers that were seeing these birds were euthanizing these animals at admit or with pretty minimal treatment. There were pretty large death rates because these animals weren't being treated. A lot of the news stations picked up on this pretty quickly and did talk about removing feeding and watering stations for a lot of these areas. And then a lot of places just really heavily PPE'd up, instituted quarantine procedures, did a lot of safety procedures, maybe didn't even take some of these birds in purely because they just didn't know what it was very early on in the disease. So this disease ended up being called the Eastern Songbird Morbidity and Mortality Event of the summer of 2024. It also, a shorter term, was the Eastern Songbird Ocular Syndrome Event. They have not created a different name for it yet, as far as I'm aware. So that's kind of what we're going with for that disease process. So there were a variety of different hypotheses as to what was happening with this disease. Again, some of these things came up very early on. Some of them they developed as this disease was going through the course. So could this be some sort of novel infectious disease? This is obviously what a lot of people thought of in the beginning. And actually multiple different mycoplasma species were detected in the initial testing, histopath, all sorts of things like that with birds affected. The challenge with mycoplasma is a lot of these diseases are very species specific. So a robin could have a different one than a starling, who could have a different one than a grackle or something like that. So there wasn't really one specific disease tying all of these individuals together, but these individuals were negative for the big ones. So avian influenza, West Nile, EEE, any of those diseases that could cause neurologic signs, these individuals were negative for. So the fun one, I think that a lot of people were thinking this was this cicada-specific fungal exposure. So there's a Massospora fungal disease called the zombie fungus, which is fantastic. And initially they were like, well, there's so many cicadas around, maybe these birds are getting exposed, whether on their feathers, whether they're eating these animals, and that's what's causing these clinical signs. However, they didn't find any evidence of this fungus on necropsies and histopath in these birds. Then the next kind of logical step too was that a lot of people were trying to keep the cicadas off of their plants, off of their trees, especially fruiting trees. And so there were a lot more pesticides or insecticides in use. So people were like, it must be that. And interestingly enough, there were organochlorine residues found in multiple birds, but they weren't found in any of the cicadas, which does bring up, was that appropriate use of the insecticides? And if these birds were being exposed potentially from something else, that's kind of a bigger concern of utilizing these very poisonous chemicals. And then lastly, and obviously from the title of this presentation, what we're going to focus on, could this be vitamin deficiency? So relatively early on, when they were kind of putting two and two together and realizing that these birds and the emergence were happening at the same time, they realized that vitamin A is concentrated within the eyes of cicadas, but really nowhere else in their body. And the problem is when predatorial species, which can be songbirds in this situation, eat insects, especially these big-bodied guys, they're ingesting mostly the innards of the animals and not so much the heads. So they're getting nutrition, but they're not getting enough vitamins, minerals, things like that. Because it is near Halloween, I added this slide in there because I think this fungus is fascinating. So the Massospora fungus, or that zombie fungus, is a fascinating disease where it infects these guys and completely replaces the abdomen of the cicadas, and their reproductive organs or external genitalia actually fall off, and they actually they still attempt to breed, and they do have some behavioral differences, which is why they call it like a zombie disease, but they try to mate and that's how they spread the disease, and then they end up dying. So it's just fascinating. Purely because it is Halloween, that's why I added this slide, because I think it's crazy. Okay, so moving to our periodical cicada broods. So what is this? What is happening? So as you may or may not know, there are annual cicadas, which occur annually, especially in the Midwest. It is a pretty loud sound once you get May, June, July from these guys. But then there are 13 and 17-year cicada species. There's about 17 species that do this. And what happens is that they live the majority of their lives underground as a nymph stage in their developmental kind of process. And when they emerge, they are out for about 2-ish months. They breed and then they die. And so they're actually external or out of the ground for 1% or less of their lifetime, which is absolutely crazy. But what happens is that every once in a while, you have this crossover of a 13 and a 17 year. Usually you have one or the other, but not a crossover. In 2024, we had the privilege of being in an area where we had the crossover of brood 13 and brood 19. So the Northern Illinois brood and then the Great Southern brood. And I put a little star on this map right here. It is a little bit more southern than we are. So Chicago is a little bit closer to the Great Lake up here. But I would say that we definitely experienced an overlap of those two broods, mainly because cicadas were everywhere. They were coating every single house, tree, bush, animal, you name it. The left two photos are actually from my front yard. I don't know if you guys can see it well, but each of these tiny little brown dots here is a cicada. When they die off, they are in piles that can be inches thick at the base of the trees, which fascinatingly, give it a few days and they're all missing because the animals eat them up. And then for us, we were seeing them in every crevice of our building because they would just come in with animals. They would come in when people opened the doors. So you can see this lucky opossum case has not only 2 freeloaders, he has a cicada down here and then a daddy longlegs up here. So they were everywhere all the time. It was deafening, the sound that these guys made. So on May 23rd, the National Wildlife Health Center actually sent out an email to a couple different Illinois rehabilitators and rehabilitation centers saying, hey, there is a likelihood of maybe potentially seeing some cases that are similar to what happened in 2021. Please be on the lookout. Little did they know, and little did we know at the time, that on May 21st, we actually saw our first case of this, which was in I believe, a brown-headed cowbird. And at that time, again, I believed we didn't quite know what was happening, and so we did end up euthanizing that animal purely based on infectious disease suspicion. By the end of July, so just 2 months, we had admitted 235 suspect cases in 9 different species. So American kestrel, American robin, blue jay, brown-headed cowbird, common grackle, Cooper's hawk, European starling, house sparrow, and red-winged blackbird. So quite a few in that short period of time. So this chart shows you kind of a breakdown of admits in 2022 and 2023, purely based for comparison versus 2024, and then what we thought suspects in 2024 were.